welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, the author of about 50 works, including the Harbinger series, one of the 4 authors in the Harbinger series. I've been editing the next one out. That's why that one comes to mind.
And I am Molly Jo Riley. I am producer of the podcast and writer of the Unemployment Cookbook and the upcoming mystery location novel, NOLA.
And a reminder to those of you listening to us, the audio-only version, you can catch us live 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Tuesday evenings, or you can watch later on YouTube or aarongansky.com at your convenience. So if you are interested in watching us and getting these invites to our live broadcasts, add Firsts in Fiction podcast at gmail.com to your Google Plus circles, and then you'll get those notifications. If you are watching us on YouTube, we do ask that you hit that thumbs up button. That helps us out quite a bit. So we do have some new book alerts here. Pops, you have Unspoken out, and that's been out now for at least 1 full week, correct?
Oh, I think it's been out maybe 2-3 weeks. I think it's been on all the platforms for a couple of weeks anyway. So it's off like a herd of turtles.
Excellent. Glad to hear it.
I know my mom
and Molly
got on her wish list, so you'll be getting at least 1 book sale next week.
Thank you.
And Molly Jo, you've got crowdfunding your way to success. And how's that going?
It's not. It kind of plateaued, leveled out a little bit, but I haven't been doing promoting it other than here on the podcast. But yeah, it's just a simple little booklet I put together with some helpful tips that have encouraged others with their own crowdfunding and crowdsourcing projects. And so it was kind of fun to put that together. It's available on Kindle.
Excellent.
And
sounds great.
Aaron, you have a book coming out in a week, yes?
I do. Maybe even less than a week. I feel like it's the 15th when it releases.
Less than a week, yeah.
So I need to put together a book launch for that. I have not yet done that. I am a terrible, terrible human being. So that's going to be on my to-do list. And by my to-do list,
say that you mean my
I mean
to-do list.
Your to-do list.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. We'll get you a plate.
Good to know. Please do.
Yeah. I'm going to have to work that out. So we'll keep you posted on it. Just check me out on Facebook or on Twitter, and you'll get some information about when I'm going to do that. It'll probably be live, probably be like a Facebook page kind of a thing. And you guys can all kind of hop in, and I'll pop in with some questions, and we'll do some giveaways, and we'll do stuff like that. So it'll be fun. Our Ask the Author question comes from Chris again. He has 2. And so if you remember Chris from last week, he's now asking, his next question is, do you use beta readers to read your manuscript? And I feel like we talked about this, but it's been quite some time since we talked about beta readers, so I'll just kind of try and keep this a little bit short. We've got a lot of information to cover tonight. My answer is yes, I do use beta readers. I only have a few, and I think the number 1 rule for beta readers is keep the numbers small. 2, possibly 3. You don't want anything more than that. A couple other things to keep in mind. Make sure that you are respecting your beta readers. Make sure that you are reciprocating. So if they have a project that they need you to read, make sure that you're doing that so that you guys can work together. It's kind of like a critique group, but it's a little more, it's smaller. And because it's smaller, you're able to, I think, get a lot more done. And when you have beta readers reading your stuff often, they get a sense of what your voice is, what you're trying to accomplish, what your vision is for the project, and so they're able to kind of accentuate that rather than trying to change it or edit your voice. They're able to accentuate your voice. So having a good stable of beta readers in your back pocket can be a very, very valuable thing. Pops, how about you?
Well, I've not used beta readers very often, so the answer is going to be pretty much no. My wife has read everything before I send them out, and every once in a while someone else will. Part of the reason I've not used them is after my first book, and actually my second book, then I was under contract for every book that I produced. So I knew it was going to be edited by the publisher, so I didn't worry with that too much. I'm not opposed to the idea, but I'm pretty much a lone wolf or a lone dachshund or something like that. I don't know. Um, so I tend to work alone and do things alone and do everything myself. So I've not really done that much. Again, the only thing I would add to that though is just like critique groups. I don't like critique groups either. Some people love them, but because they can do more harm than good. What I would say about that though is if you get beta readers that know a little something, that just they're not there just to read and make comments about things they don't know anything about. So get some that can make a valid contribution to what it is you do.
Excellent. How about you, Molly?
I would say yes. I have a very small, trustworthy circle of fellow writers who do get my new chapters as I write them, except for Aaron because he doesn't like to get my chapters one at a time. You'd rather have the entire manuscript. Something about too many changes as I go along. I don't know. Becky is also one of my beta readers. She reads all of my stuff as I send it out. So I have 2 Gansky beta readers, and eventually you're going to get hooked into it too.
Oh, thanks for the warning.
You're welcome. Yeah. I use beta readers while I go as I'm writing because they can help me clarify situations, or if I'm stuck on something, I'll ask their opinion and they'll help me kind of feel out what I want to do and how I want to progress. One woman in particular is in New Orleans and she's been very helpful. We've never met in person, but we met online through mutual friends, and she has just been extravagantly helpful and informative while I'm writing NOLA. So that's really helpful to me. Yeah, my beta readers affirm that what I'm doing is moving forward, being accurate and acceptable. And once the first draft is completely done, I'm also going to give them the full manuscript along with you, Al. And so I'll get a little bit of feedback. But overall, I agree with Aaron in keeping it small, like 3 or 4 at the most.
Excellent. So as a point of clarification, Molly, I think what you're talking about is alpha readers, because these are people who are reading your work before it's actually completed, correct?
I apologize. Yes, I guess that would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So a beta reader would read when you are completed, when you give them the completed manuscript. And of course, I will still be your beta reader, and I'm sure my mom will be too. So just a short thing. Now, alpha readers have their own role as well, and I think especially in critique groups, alpha readers, those would be considered alpha readers, and they have a place as well. Molly, you've already mentioned some of them about keeping you on the right track and being able to identify things that you might need to address later on, those types of things. But they both have their part. They both have a role to play, and so both can be positive if you are doing them properly. So, but again, not a requirement, not a necessity. It's really up to you on that. So, now let's get into our main topic. We've got a lot to cover tonight. Setting, place. Last week we talked about time, and I just want to be clear again on what we mentioned last week about setting and what it entails. It refers to the time and the place and the circumstances in which your story takes place. Normally we just think of the place, the where, but we don't often think of the when or the during what circumstances, the how, if you will. Those are of equal importance, and tonight we're going to look at how to set the place of your setting, the location, how to help that kind of come to life. Now, again, last week we were talking about past, present, future, etc. Right now we're talking more about place settings.
Ooh, yeah, place settings.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay.
All right. I used your pun, Pops, and you're gonna judge me about using your pun.
That'll teach you to use my bad humor.
Yeah. So place settings. The first thing that you want to do, you want to establish the place of your novel, and you have to consider the following things. First of all, non-negotiable, your story has to take place in a particular location. Doesn't matter if it's fictional or real, but it has to be in a particular location at a particular time. And the reason is, well, there are several reasons. First of all, you've got to have a physical setting. The heart of every story is action, and that action must flow and it must change over the course of the plot. Stories are difficult to understand when they don't take place in an actual location. Molly, you were mentioning before the podcast about something like Gravity, which takes place in space, which might seem like not a place at all, but space is very much a place, and we can still describe that, the location in space, if they're lost in space, what nebula they're in, what galaxy they're in. Interstellar would be a great example of that. Usually they're on a spaceship. The spaceship becomes the setting, the place setting. I said it again. I'm going to say that a lot. But you want to know that there is a particular location. I'll probably say this later in the cast, but I remember reading a book that was supposed to take place in a particular city, big time American city, real city, and I had no clue. The only reason I knew it was supposed to take place there is because somebody used the name. If they had not have used the name, and when they did, I was a little taken aback. Like, the world that you're describing looks nothing like this particular city, what I know of this city. And so it was, I thought there was a significant lack of detail, specific detail, and that left me feeling very unconnected to the characters as well, strangely, because I couldn't put the characters in a physical setting. It made it hard for me to relate to the characters as well. And so there's a kind of a weird symbiotic relationship between character and setting. We'll probably get to that a little bit later. But Pops, you were mentioning, like, in terms of stage plays, yeah, you had something you wanted to say about that.
You know, and another way to, departing from our show notes here, another way to think of setting is to think of environment. It's the environment in which the story takes place. Now, that might also include time, last week's, but here we're going to talk about the physical environment. So Molly's writing about New Orleans, with a very unique city, and that's the environment, so that sets the place, and that helps set up the story. Even if you go to a bunch of different places, I've done books that are, skipped all over the world, but you still have to have for every scene there needs to be a place. And the way I remember it is, I used to love to go to stage plays. I even directed one local stage play, which was the female version of The Odd Couple. But if you go to see a stage play like Neil Simon's The Odd Couple, you'll notice there is a setting. They put the scenes or settings, backdrops, those sorts of things on the stage for the actors to do their work in front of. So in The Odd Couple, you're in I think it's Manhattan, apartment where the two guys live. So that tells us something, and all that action is going to take place there, and we get an idea of how bad Oscar is, and how dirty Oscar is, and how clean and the roommate is, Felix. So it tells you quite a bit. So it does give that environment. And so just like a stage play has to have backdrops, so fiction needs to have its backdrops. And television and movies are visual, and a lot of people don't realize this, but so are books. And the reason they're visual is because the author takes the time to describe where the scene is taking place, where the action is taking place, and the reader will create that in their mind. So it is visual. It's just not the visuals are laid out in front of them. They have to read it to get those visuals. But that's one reason it's so important.
Nice.
And I like thinking of it in terms of stage plays because there is a cost, right? There's a cost involved when you're designing the setting for a play. You've got to make this backdrop. Well, you're either going to be buying the paints, or if there's the scene calls for a table with a vase on it, you're going to probably be purchasing the table and the vase. And so what I like to tell my students is to consider the price of each object. If it's important and you absolutely have to have the vase there because it's going to eventually end up over somebody's head, you're going to buy that vase. And what that means in fiction terms is you're going to take time to describe that vase. It goes back to Chekhov's gun over the mantle. If you take the time to describe it, it's probably going to play a role in the setting. However, we don't need to describe every individual flower as we're walking through a field of flowers. We don't need to describe every little daisy and how this daisy is different than that one. That's going to take too much time, and it's going to cost the reader's attention, and eventually if you're overwhelming them with detail, they're going to perhaps resist and not like it. I think it's better to err on the side of caution and give too much detail rather than too little. It's always easier to take out than it is to put in. And so I would say on your first drafts, your early drafts, go ahead and overwrite with all your detail, and then come back and trim it up some. But think of it in terms of a stage play, what the cost is for each prop.
You don't want to choke the reader with too much detail. I call it leaving room for the reader's imagination. The reader will always fill in the gaps. So you give them enough, they'll build the scene, and then they'll dress the scene, as they say in the world of theater, in their minds. So, yeah, don't choke them, like you say. You don't want to overwhelm them with it. You give them enough so they know where they are and they can understand the action that is about to take place. Let me give you a quick example of why that's important. I was once asked to review a book. Oddly enough, it was for the second book, and the first one had been a New York Times bestseller. The second book, not so much. And there's some action that took place in a cave, and I'm trying to follow the action. And I'm doing the review of this thing, and then all of a sudden we switch from the cave floor to a ledge that's overhead. Well, I didn't know there was a ledge. So I had to stop and go, did I miss something? I have to back up, try to find out where that ledge was introduced. Well, it never was. And that happened time and time again. So in film, they do things called establishing shots. You familiar with that term?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So if you like watch the X-Files, and they're going to be in the FBI building, there's always a shot of the outside, the exterior of the FBI building, and then that's a shot on the inside. That way the viewer knows, we're inside the FBI building. Well, you do the same thing in writing. You have to establish where the action's taking place, and you give enough detail, like you say, but not too much. And I certainly agree with the idea is if you're going to overwrite, do it in the first draft. The real writing, the real magic takes place when you go back over it. So, yeah, make the mistakes in the first draft, overdo it, and then you can come back and start cutting things down. Liposuction. Literary liposuction.
Oh, that's a good term. Okay, I'm going to write that down right now. Literary liposuction. Is that Al's axiom number,
let's
72?
go with, that'll be fine.
Okay, I'm on it.
Now, we also want to remember, excuse me, that setting can also be part of the conflict. It can be, and I think should be, part of the conflict, even if it's as simple as a character being cold or warm, just putting us tangibly in their skin to feel the weather of the place where they are. But setting really becomes a character usually when it's working against the protagonist. Pops, you've mentioned The Old Man and the Sea. I think another good example here would be The Perfect Storm, where tales of survival, anything about man versus nature, their setting is absolutely key, and it even becomes a character because it becomes like the antagonist in a way, and so you have to make sure that you're developing that. One of the examples that I'm thinking of is To Build a Fire by Jack London, in which case a man is going from one base to another and up in Alaska somewhere, and it's deathly cold outside, and he is pushing too hard too fast, and he thinks he can make it, but it turns out he can't. And so the setting becomes very, very real there, and becomes a character almost in that way. And I explored this idea in my first novel, which is not published, because I thought that the lack of setting would produce conflict. And so I thought, wouldn't it be neat if there was no setting? How do I write a story with no setting? And I thought it was very avant-garde and very, cutting edge and the bleeding edge of fiction and blah, blah, blah. And what it resulted was just a confusing section for the reader. The reader had no idea what was going on because there were no details. So I would recommend that urge to purposely withhold information about the setting. I don't think that's a good quality. But there are, of course, for every rule there is an exception. And Pops, you were talking about one of the Twilight Zone episodes.
Mm.
Yeah, I grew up on Twilight Zone, and I love them. I especially like Rod Serling because nobody wrote dialogue like Rod Serling. Probably for good reason. Only Rod Serling could pull that off.
Yeah.
No one else could. But nonetheless, he did one story in which he removed the setting, which I thought was interesting. And it's 5 characters in search of an exit, and it's 5 people. They're one's a military man, one's a clown, one's a ballerina, one's a hobo, and they're in this place, and the viewer has no idea where they are. the best thing you can see is this gray behind them, and through the course of the story, you find out it sounds like metal, it feels cool like metal, and then, of course, this thing was done in late 50s, early 60s, so I'm not giving anything away here. Turns out they're toys in a can, like a toy box, except it's a can, and they come to life when no one else is around with that, but they can't figure out where they are because they have no setting. All they have is this circular contraption that they're in, this can. And in that case, what Rod Serling was doing is he was trying to frustrate his characters at the same time as frustrating the viewers on purpose, because that's part of the mystery. Where are they? Why can't I figure anything out? So he had taken away from us anything to tell us what was going on. So that can be done, but it is very rare. It's usually for very short stuff. You could probably get away with it in flash fiction, or maybe something as long as a 22-minute television show or something. But it's going to be rare, and probably risky.
Mm. And is the payoff going to be what you want it to be? Serling obviously is a master, and so I'm sure it's going to be. But I don't know. You might be able to make the argument that the tin can itself becomes the setting, and it's just stripped down. It has no other bells and whistles.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is the setting, but you don't get to know that till the end. So
True.
Since we're not told they're in a can, we have to figure it out as we watch it, and they have to figure it out. So it's purposely withheld information for the purpose of suspense, and it works out very, very well. But there's a reason you don't see many Twilight Zones with no setting. They always have settings, so that was maybe the only one that I can think of anyway, where the setting is purposely concealed.
And kind of going back to this idea of balancing your detail, you were mentioning that they're in this tin can and they don't know that. They're trying to figure it out. I was thinking of not the Telltale Heart, just kidding, The Pit and the Pendulum. Edgar Allan Poe's Pit and the Pendulum, where the man is in this dungeon and he is in complete blackness trying to figure out where he is. And so there's a good 2.5 pages where he's circling this place, feeling along the walls, and you get just a ton of detail. Some would argue it's a little bit too much. I know definitely my students don't like it. They get really bored and kind of tune out there because I don't need the actual, how is it Brett Anthony Johnston says, we don't need the linguistic blueprint of the library. All we need are the slatted windows and the smell of dusts and old pages. Those, just a couple details, and then boom, there the reader's going to construct their own library.
Dean Koontz did a story that has always stuck with me, and his first setting, of all places, is a walk-in closet. His character's in a walk-in closet. You don't get that immediately. It takes a few paragraphs, but what was the guy's name? Corvasi? I can't remember the character's name now. But he wakes up covered in coats that have come off the hangers and in the blackness, and he realizes he's in his closet. He has no memory of how he got into the closet, why he would be in the closet, and then Koontz did something brilliant. He expanded one more room. He comes out of that closet into his room where he has his computer. He's a writer, and on the screen of his computer are the words, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, and it just goes on and on and on and on. So now he still maintains all this confusion. What is the guy doing in a closet, a walk-in closet? Why is he covered with coats? And then who's been playing on his computer? And then it expands to a wider world with each scene.
I like that. I like how you say that, and I think that it's good, kind of this idea of the establishing shot. There, instead of being the exterior, it's a lot more interior. It's a lot more focused, and then it kind of goes out. Why? Because in the establishing shot in film, you're orienting the reader's expectations, right? In this one, in this example that you've given to Dean Koontz, we're starting with the character's view, which is very small, and as his understanding expands, so does the setting and the detail of the setting. Would you say that's accurate?
Right. Yeah, that's what he was doing. Of course, there's a lot of different ways to handle this. Star Trek usually begins someplace on the Enterprise and then expands to
Mm-hmm.
someplace else. So there's really a number of ways of doing that, but you have to start somewhere. And it's always, at least in your first chapter, it should be wherever your protagonist is. If you have to start with your antagonist, make that a prologue. But you want to introduce your protagonist as soon as possible. And so usually in the first chapter, and that has to take place in some physical locale, whether it's a car moving down the road, whether it's New Orleans. I've set scenes in Seattle, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, Siberia, Antarctica, just all over the place.
Hmm.
But there's always, in fact, one of my opening scenes takes place on an iceberg, a large iceberg.
Hmm.
And the research scientist on it. And I had to describe enough so that the reader could feel cold and a little worried about being on an iceberg in Antarctica.
Well, I'd be worried about
Yeah.
being on an iceberg wherever it is. Just saying, but.
Well, the North Pole icebergs are friendly, so.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
If I were on an iceberg in the Sahara Desert, I don't think I would worry too much. Plenty
I
of
think
drinkable
I'd worry
mud.
a whole lot more if there was an iceberg in the Sahara. I think that would put me over the edge.
I wouldn't wander far.
Yeah, really.
And
So,
messing up now,
but
you bring up something that's very interesting here. Are messing up the scene, that is introducing something that doesn't belong. Think of Lost, deserted island,
mm,
tropical island,
mhm.
and a polar bear. Well, that ain't right. What's a polar bear doing on a tropical island? Of course, what that does is it gets your attention. Now you're stuck. You got to hang in there long enough to find out how a polar bear gets on a tropical island.
But they never explained it.
Yeah.
They did,
My suspicion is that
kind
show
of.
became too successful too fast, and they didn't think it would run that long.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to do with it. I kept thinking about season 3. I think these guys have written themselves into a corner.
Yeah.
Having done that, I sympathized.
That's actually an interesting structure. That show is set up on a chiastic structure, and it could have gone longer than the 6 seasons that it ran, but they limited it to 6. And I feel, and they realized it, I think, mid-season 2 or early season 3, when they realized we could go as long as we want, and they decided we're going to go 6 seasons, and we're going to use a chiastic structure, so season 1 is going to reflect season 6, 2 reflects 5, and 3 reflects 4. And so the questions that they ask in season 1 aren't really answered until season 6. A lot of them, I didn't think they were
Right.
So
particularly
is that
answered
the
well.
definition of chiastic structure?
It's one of them. Yeah, chiastic structure has can be different organizational patterns, but one of the most popular chiastic structures is the reflection, either A, B, B, A, or A, B, C, D, E, F, where D and C, E and F, and A and B. So it's like a mirror. So you either have 2 scenes mirror each other, 2 scenes mirror each other, 2 scenes mirror each other, or you have 1, 2, 3 mirrored by 3, 2, 1. But yeah,
Boy.
so they
That MFA
what's
paid
that?
off. So that MFA paid off, man.
Things I learned from
Right.
yeah, Diane
Yeah.
Sherlock taught me that at Antioch. So
Nice. How do you spell that?
thank you, Diane.
Chiastic.
CHIASTIC is chiastic, I believe. And if you're interested in that kind of organizational structure and other organizational structure, be sure to pick up my book, Right to be Heard, co-authored by Diane Sherlock. So you get to learn about chiastic structure from her because she knows more about it than do I. So thank you for that, Diane. So
The show has been brought to you by.
yes, setting. Right.
Nice.
Shameless self-promotion. Please buy that book. But if you can't afford that book and The Blood Sword, you're gonna have to make some tough choices. So
Get a loan.
but let's move on. Yeah, get a loan, exactly. Should we be considering? Well, I don't want to skip over this question here. We mentioned in the show notes having handholds, so our readers can live vicariously through our characters. And Pops, you mentioned specifically Batman needs Wayne Manor and Gotham City, which led you, Molly, to a question here. which was, if
Yes.
I may summarize, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead. I'll let you
No,
do it.
you do that. I'm getting the link to Right to be Heard.
Okay. Oh, that's fair then.
Yeah.
You say Wayne Manor and Gotham City are two distinctly different settings. One offers Batman, Bruce Wayne, his solace, the other his duty, which is interesting the way you say that. Do most stories require conflicting settings like this? Also, how much is too much? If you're scene hopping with every chapter, do you have too many settings within the story, and can this confuse your reader? Yes, it can. I'm thinking about my book right now that has multiple settings, and it's, you can kind of get away with it with epic fantasy, but for the most part, you want to kind of try and limit your settings. You look at Batman, you are going to have the Manor, you're going to have the Batcave, you're going to have Gotham City. Um, Everything else from there is going to be derivatives, like the docks of Gotham City, the cathedral in Gotham City. So you kind of know where you are on a larger scale. I would say it doesn't have to. You don't have to have multiple settings where one is playing one part and another is playing another. But it's good fiction if you do. I mean, if you can pull that off, give your character someplace they feel comfortable, and then put your character someplace they don't feel comfortable. I'm thinking specifically of, since we're on the Batman theme, the Dark Knight with the people on the boats, the ferries that Joker's going to blow up, and he gives them both the remotes to blow up the other boat. Really, a lot of interesting things there. Characters are not comfortable there, and you put a lot of interesting characters in a really interesting bind, which is complicated by their setting. The setting is a complication there, but you also get to see Batman at a restaurant having dinner with Harvey Dent, and so he's a little more relaxed there, and he doesn't have to be Batman at that time. So it does have both.
Well, the thing to
Pops,
remember
would
with the
you agree with
Batman
that?
thing, the thing to remember with Batman is there's really two people. There's one individual, but he has two lives. There's this dichotomy, and so the Wayne Manor, he's comfortable in Wayne Manor as Bruce Wayne, but when it's time for him to become that Dark Knight, he's got the Batcave. He dresses differently in it. When he goes out at night, he's a different person than he is during the day. So it's almost a split personality kind of thing, and the settings are reflecting the psychology of this character. They did this very early, back in the 30s when they created Batman. Um, it wasn't as dark then; it became darker over time. But nonetheless, they did show this dichotomy where he pretends to be one thing and then the other. And you get really the same thing if we want to say with comic books. Superman, you've got this his place of solace, but then you have the city in which he works. They don't have to be superheroes, of course. You can do that with any kind of character. Again, the old man in the sea, he needs the setting of the small village, fishing village he lives in. He needs the setting of his boat in the ocean, otherwise everything else makes no sense. So if we don't see
Right.
the problems of the ageism, that is a prejudice against older people, we don't see the ravages of time on a body and the hard work and the need to still have value and to have the love of this boy. None of that's going to make sense unless we put him in the right place and let the problems begin there. So as he comes back into the small town, then he goes back out to sea. And those are the two primary scenes, backdrops for that book. So there, aren't that many, but it's what he does in front of those.
Indeed. Now, I remember, Pops, when I first started this Hand of Adonai series, and I was trying to find a location, a setting for it. I knew I was going to be building the fantasy setting. I knew about that, but I wanted the real world setting, and I was trying to think of what city to set it in. And I remember talking with you about it. Which city should I research? Which do you think would be good? And I think your words to me were, does it have to be a real place? And for whatever reason, it hadn't occurred to me that I could use a fictional town in America. Like, I knew, okay, I'm building a fantasy world. That's obviously fictional, but I don't have to have a real city. I can make up my own, and because of that, I ended up designing North Chester, and there were several reasons for that. The advantages of fictional places, and thank you, Pops, for spurring that idea, is that you're not going to be compared to a real city. You're not going to have people nitpicking, saying, "Well, that's not the right freeway," or "That's the wrong
Mm.
street name," or "You said lane instead of avenue," or "That's not what it looks like on Sunset," and those types of things. So you've got a little more freedom to design things the way you want them to be designed. You can help them reflect the conflict or intensify the conflict. You can create all sorts of things. The history of the town, its mythology, if it's got one. Stephen King does this, and so if you read his books, most of them take place in fictional towns, but they feel very, very real and very, very familiar. And that's one of the another advantages. You can create familiar settings that are just different enough to be unique and interesting. They feel comfortable, they feel familiar, but they are not because they are different and unique. You've created them. You can do your own topography, put your businesses where you want your businesses, your Walmart where you want your Walmarts, your mountains where you want your mountains, um, all of that. And so the only thing that you need to remember is that if you're going to be doing a fictional town, you need to make sure you're keeping track of it. Draw a map if you have to, but keep track of the names of stores and places that your characters frequent so you're not getting those mixed up. This applies whether or not you're doing a small town, a big city, or just another world or planet. You got to keep track of everything. But you also have a lot of leeway, and you can have a lot of fun with doing a fictional town. So I've done that. But then in Harrison Sawyer, I chose to do that in a real town, a real city, for a number of different reasons. But because I've been talking for a while, Pops, I'm going to let you take this. What are some advantages to using real places?
Well, there's a good number of them, and of course you can do both, really. In fact, I think you did that in The Bargain, where you based it on a small town near where you live, but you renamed it. So you can take a real place, give it a different name, and use the same layout and imagery and all of those sorts of things. But an advantage to using real place is familiarity to people. So I did a lot of books in San Diego, mostly because that's where I grew up. So I knew the city quite well. Familiarity. Sometimes cities are themselves a character. They have their own personality. Cincinnati is not like Chicago. Chicago is not like New York. Miami's different. Naples, Florida is different. Dallas, Texas is different than Arizona, than Phoenix. So they are, Taos, New Mexico is very unique. Santa Fe is just a place all its own. There's really nothing else like it. So their names are well known. People will recognize them, have some of the basic information of them, and then you can highlight certain aspects of that. Because sometimes reality is better than fiction. There are some places that just fiction can't touch because the reality is so interesting. It's easy to get information. That's another reason to use real ones, especially with the internet these days. You don't have to go down to the library and get out all these maps. You can now do it from comfort of your laptop and even do the street views, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit. It adds a new level of realism. And then Molly had something here about historical references.
Yeah, I think when you're using a real location, to historical references can draw the reader in deeper, making them feel more connected to the story. For instance, if you're writing a story in Dallas in 1963 or shortly after, there's a lot of hot political climate that comes with that.
Mm-hmm.
NOLA, which I'm currently working on, takes place in post-Katrina New Orleans. And while it's not a major factor, it is a way of life still 10 years later in New Orleans, and so that has surfaced in the book as a reference. And I think that dose of reality can draw the reader in and make them feel more of a part. Like, this isn't just casual reading. This isn't, it's just not a book on a shelf. They feel more connected, more a part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you're setting it in post-Katrina NOLA. New Orleans pre-Katrina is very different than post-Katrina. But one of the things that the hurricane that came through didn't damage was the spirit of the people, the resolve of the people, specifically their culture, right? Their culture is preserved. And that's what, in what I've seen of NOLA, you really develop that culture, that climate of NOLA, and so it feels very real, very tangible. I've never been to NOLA, but I'd like to. I think it would be kind of fun, but I kind of get that itch scratched when I read your book, and so
Oh, thank
that's
you.
really, really kind of a cool thing. Absolutely. So culture is a big deal, and we may talk about that if we have time. If we don't, I'll just mention it now. Make sure you're researching the culture of your town. Um, San Diego is pretty laid back. Different parts of LA have different kind of personalities, right? Especially, I can't think of the name of the street now. Olivera Street has its own kind of culture to it, which is going to be very different than downtown in the business district of LA. And so, knowing these types of things, and that sometimes cities have multiple cultures, and sometimes they have one pervasive culture, knowing those types of things is good. That's one of the things that you'll need to do, whether you're doing a real setting or a fictional setting. You're going to have to do your world building. And really the difference between the two is this: do you create it or do you research it? The questions that you're going to ask yourself are going to be the same for fictional or real. It's just a matter of, are you researching it to find the answers, or are you kind of coming up with your own answers? But you want to know what sorts of people live there. Why do these people live there? What do they like? What do they fear? What kind of economy keeps the town going? This is a big thing with in fantasy. I can't remember the episode of Writing Excuses I was listening to, but they were talking about the economy of fantasy novels. And when you have somebody slip a shopkeeper a gold coin for an iron sword, you've just said that iron is equal value as gold. Or you know what I'm saying? Like it doesn't seem to quite make sense. So thinking about that, how does the economy keep the town going? Is it rural? Is it urban? Big thing here: use proper nouns wherever you can. In Everywhere and Nowhere, which is contracted and hopefully will come out maybe next year sometime. We say
Yeah.
the factory rather than just the local pizza place. We say, Harry's Hardware instead of, Ace Hardware or something like that. You want to come up with, rather than chains, specific, kind of small town type thing. But using these specific nouns and capitalizing them, giving them real names and titles, is going to go a long way to help your town come alive. Does that make sense?
It does.
Definitely. Yes.
So research it or come up with it. Molly, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, whether you're researching or creating, it's really important to keep a reference book. I call it a story Bible. It's a binder that's going to be full of those magazine clippings for ideas, character sheets, just absolutely everything. Because as you've been saying, Aaron, you're going to want to go back and reference to make sure you have all your ducks in a row and everything. So definitely keep a story Bible handy and keep track. Draw maps if you have to, little ideas, notes of the settings, not just your characters, not just your background, but also the environment and the setting. That's so important.
Yeah, Terry Blackstock used to do that. She used to keep a binder, sometimes 2 or 3 binders, and she would have buildings in them and what those look like, and she would just clip them out of magazines and newspapers as she found them. Of course, you can do this digitally too. If you're a Scrivener user, you can dump a lot of information into that. But I used to do that, and I did a series of books that had a specific house in it, and I got the floor plan offline.
Nice.
It's a real floor plan, but I just had it handy so I could describe where everything was, where the big staircase was, and stuff like that. So
Pinterest is really great for storing your digital scrapbook, like that, digital clippings.
Yeah, you can do that. So it's Trello.com is a way of keeping information. That's online. Trello.com. It's free. It's a card system.
Oh, I've not heard of that.
Trello.com. And you just it allows you to work with other people. That's its primary purpose. But I've put characters in it and lots of different details. Maybe some brass tacks. What do you think, Aaron? We get down to how to do this.
Absolutely.
The time we have remaining here.
Yeah, because you've done both fictional towns and real towns. So what's the process that you go through? What are some tips and tricks for you?
Well, in several cases, I've used real towns as a basis for my fictional town. So I did a series of books that were set in a seaside town called Santa Rita, which is really Ventura. And we used to live in
Mm.
Ojai, which is a small inland city near Ventura. And I've always liked Ventura, so I used it as the primary template for Santa Rita, and I just changed whatever I wanted to change. So I changed the name of the city, but many of the buildings are on a hillside. There's a freeway that runs out front, and then just the other side of that is the ocean. So I used all of that, and that became the town. And I did that for several books. The Incumbent, Before Another Dies, and Director's Cut, and all those take place in Santa Rita. It's loosely based on Ventura. I got to push everything around that I wanted. But I also did a couple of books in the California mountain. It was a Ridgeline series, and I based that on 3 California mountain communities. Crestline, which is a small mountain community. Arrowhead, which is bigger, but I didn't want Ridgeline to be that large, so I sized it down a little bit. And Wrightwood, which is in a different set of California mountains, and I just took what I liked from each. And so they're real places, but I made a fictional place out of them. And then I use Google Maps a lot, and that's one of the most powerful things a fiction writer can have right now, is the Google Maps, especially the street view. So in my novel Wounds, which is about a serial killer in San Diego, I would go to all the sites where the murders took place, and I would use Google Maps Street View. It's a little man, you put it down on the street, and then you can see everything around you. And so the houses I describe in there are real houses on real streets. The trees are real trees. I have one victim is found next to a particular tree. I can show you that tree in San Diego, and it's because I used Google Maps to zero in on that one spot.
Wow.
And it made my writing a lot easier because I could use, the sinuous sidewalks. I could tell all the sidewalks were curved, and then I could see that there was grass everywhere. Today it would probably all be brown because of our drought, but
Probably.
so that's what I did there. Sometimes a map is very helpful. I've used those for a real place, and then I just change them around. You can change the names of streets and just make it your own. So you can use real places for fictional places. Now, what you were doing, Aaron, is a little more difficult. You created a fictional world. So when doing things like science fiction, if you're doing Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama, he had to invent that whole Rama thing. Okay, you have a current world town that you could base on a real one if you wanted to. But then you have where most of the story takes place, which is fully fictional.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I do, and I like that. I like the dichotomy of having those two settings: the modern American setting, and then the kind of more medieval fantasy setting, and it puts the characters out of their element. And that's one of the things that we haven't really touched on. We've touched a little bit about the symbiosis between character and setting, but not so much on how you can really get the most bang for your buck out of that. And one of the things that I used to have my students do is I'd have them write a story called The Stranger, in which a stranger comes to town, and he immediately or she immediately knows that they're a stranger because they don't fit in. And so what is it about this town that's different than everything that this person has had experience in? That's a good one. Or I also do one called Homecoming, where a character comes back to the place where they grew up after 20 years. And so they are struck by what has changed or what hasn't changed. And that's kind of a common trope in a lot of fiction. But just doing short fiction that way helps you to remember that character and setting are inextricable. You've heard the old expression, you can take the cowboy out of Texas, you can't take the Texas out of cowboy. No matter how many horses you use, you can't drag it out of them. And there's a lot to be said about that. Send a cowboy to New York and let him walk around the big city. Let him be uncomfortable. Then you've got the business traveler who goes to all the major cities, but
there was a
stuck
television show.
Remember what show was that?
McCloud was a 90-minute show, a mystery. McCloud is a New Mexico sheriff.
Yeah.
So he always wore a big woolen coat, and he had his cowboy hat, and he would ride his horse through downtown New York, and that was the whole thing. That was part of the tension, was he had trouble with New Yorkers, and New Yorkers couldn't understand him, including his boss. So yeah, you're right on the money with that.
Yeah. So as you're designing your fictional settings, if you're doing fictional settings, you still need to ask yourself, how is this setting going to impact my characters? And how are my characters going to impact the setting? It's, again, symbiosis. Pops, did you have any pointers about using real cities?
Yeah, as I said before, I've set books in San Diego. Most of my early books are in San Diego. And then some of my later ones were Seattle, Washington, D.C., Rome, Naples, Italy, Siberia, just all over the place. And that's a lot of fun, but you do have to do a lot of research. You don't want to start getting letters about, as one person did, when she wrote about the great skiing in Denver. And if you've been to Denver, you know there's no great skiing in Denver. It's a big flat area. Kind of need the mountains. Of course, what she was thinking is there's a lot of great skiing in Colorado. That part's true, not Denver. So you have to do some research. So be prepared to do your research on that. If you can visit, that's one of the best things to do is visit if you can. Now, we live in a world where you don't necessarily have to do that. You can get documentaries, you can use Google Maps, you can do all kinds of things. You can go to things on site that will describe a city. There's really a lot to learn without you ever leaving the house. But if you can go, then you get a greater sense of things. You can write a lot about Fort Worth, but you can't write about its smells until you get down to the area where they slaughter cattle.
Yeah.
Last couple things, let me say that because it looks like my battery's running out on my computer, and I didn't bring my plug in. The other thing I would say then, and the last thing I would really want to get across, is don't be afraid to put something fictional in a real setting. So in my first two books, I mentioned Kensington Memorial Hospital. There's no such place in San Diego, but I did base it on a real hospital. And I had been in that hospital. I used its exterior, and I used its parking lot, and I used all of those things. I just changed the name of it because I didn't want people thinking of Sharps Hospital. I wanted them to think of this other place, and that allowed me to change things on the inside to make it real. So don't be afraid of doing that. Or when I was working with Jeff Struker, he was dealing with special ops, and that's a secret Army group that he knew a lot about, but there's a lot of things he couldn't talk about. So we set up their meeting place in a real Army base, and we called the place the Concrete Palace, but there is no Concrete Palace. We just made it up and put it in a different place. So we inserted fictional in reality and changed it just enough. So you can do that. So there's no either or. You can be largely fictional with some and base that on real places, or you can be dealing with real places but put some fictional elements in it. You have all that kind of freedom.
Nice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And finding the right mix for you is going to be key. Borrow a little bit from the real, borrow a little bit from the fictional, mix them together, see what you get. But again, if it's real, research it. If it's fictional, make sure you do your world building. We are just about out of time for this week. We do have a few other things here on the show notes that we didn't quite get to, but I'll just put those up on the show notes when I put this up tomorrow. Hopefully I'll put it up tomorrow. In the meantime, before we sign off, Molly, I know our numbers were a little bit down. We had some technical issues getting the invitations out. Did we have any questions or comments in the room?
Tess DeGroot was the only one in the chat room, and we were responding to just chatter going back and forth, dialoguing, which all the comments that you guys were making. She said she would say don't use your stepmom as a beta reader because no matter how bad the story is, she'll always tell you it's the best thing she's ever read. She put her comments in here once or twice, so I'm thinking maybe Google has just been having difficulties and not recognizing the whole kit and caboodle of the podcast this week. Tess also said she finds Victorian writers give much more description than modern writers do. For example, D.H. Lawrence took a page and a half to describe the flowers on the veranda in Lady Chatterley's Lover. She likes the Twilight Zone episode that Al referenced. She asked for the spelling of chiastic, as did I. I put up the link to Write to Be Heard, and she's going to steal your writing prompts for her creative writing club.
Excellent. Sounds good to me. I will expect some kickback on that, so some royalties for sure. Because I got them from other people and I need to pay them royalties. So.
Sure, that's what happened. I want to give out one last thing as a resource. I use Google Earth, which is pretty similar to Google Maps, but Google Earth is
I've used it, yeah.
bigger, and I really like that. You can do almost everything the same as Google Maps, but it's just a little bit different feel to it. And you can get the street eye view, the bird's eye view. You can get down and get eye level with everything. It's a lot of fun.
Nice. Excellent. Well, that is about all the time that we have for today. Next week, we're looking at circumstances. Don't forget to ask the author. We do need some more questions, so hit us up on Facebook or on Twitter or at aarongansky.com. You can find us at frankly-mydearmojo.com, at altongansky.com, and at aarongansky.com. And before we sign off, just another quick reminder that at August 20th, Molly Jo, you will be presenting a lesson or a presentation on growing your social media swarm at the Writers of Kern, the High Desert, or the California Writers Club, Kern County branch. And so you'll be up in Bakersfield doing that. I will be up there as well. So if you, I won't be presenting though. But if you want to stop by and say hi and you're in the Central California area, Pops, then you're more than welcome to. We'd love to see you there. So. And
Aaron, you will also have your books for sale as well, because they didn't come in when you were presenting last month, correct?
Correct.
So now you will have books for sale.
I will have some books for sale.
It's going to be a great fun day.
You will have books for sale.
Yes.
Indeed, I will
have my cookbook for sale. Well,
excellent. I'm looking forward to it. It should be a lot of fun. So, we thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.